Hi, I'm Nick and welcome to Press Start.
The gaming industry, one of the most influential and profitable industries in the world today. Today, games are generally on par with Hollywood movies in terms of style, creativity, plot, and more importantly, sales. It's taken 40 years to reach this point, and it's had its fair share of problems. Today, we're going to look at the North American video game crash of 1983.
Prior to 1983, silicon and code were more valuable than silver and gold. All was going well for the industry until it all came tumbling down. 25 years later, we can look back and see what lessons had to be learned, and also understand that without it, the gaming industry wouldn't be what it is today.
The industry was born in 1947 with a missile simulator game, but it didn't begin its first baby steps of evolution until 1972, with the mass popularity of Pong and the arcade generation. With North America leading the way, video games throughout the 70s consisted of simple, pixelated games such as Pong, Asteroids, and Space Invaders. By 1977, the amount of simple games like these suggested to consumers that the industry was a one-trick pony, ready to be put out to pasture. In turn, the industry ditched the idea of a one-console, one-game idea in favour of a single system using changeable ROM cartridges, starting the second generation of gaming.
At the time, it was undeniably supported. Whilst the bargain bins were filling up with the carcasses of the unsold first generation, a huge number of manufacturers threw in the towel and were blindly running for the exits, their faith quickly and profoundly shaken by the industry that had made them rich. But not all companies were scared, and it was this determination to progress that marks the difference between the respective financial disaster of 1977 and 1983.
There are multiple factors as to why the crash of 1983 came about. Today we have three home consoles fighting for dominance in today's market: Microsoft's Xbox 360, Sony's PlayStation 3, and Nintendo's Wii. Back in the birth of the 80s though, there were just too many consoles on the market. The Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the ColecoVision, Intellivision, the Coleco Gemini, the Vectrex, the Magnavox Odyssey 2, Fairchild Channel F system, Emerson Arcadia 2001, are just to name the major consoles, but there were still dozens more on the market. To steal sales from other manufacturers, some companies had created consoles with interchangeable software. For example, the ColecoVision had an expansion module that would allow you to play your Atari 2600 games. In fact, it was so easy to recreate the Atari 2600 with standard parts that the Coleco released the Gemini, which was an identical clone of the console.
Imagine if Sony created a disk drive that would allow you to play Xbox 360 games. Imagine the size of the lawsuit. But back in the 80s, it was all completely legal.
Activision was the first official third-party publishing team assembled. Formed initially by 5 former members of Atari staff, they formed the company as Atari didn't allow programmers and developers to garner any credit for their work and were paid no royalties based on sales. Many people saw what Activision had become and decided to create their own developing and publishing teams. Unlikely companies that had their own publishing teams included Quaker Oats, the cereal company. They released a few games such as Eggomania. A company under the name of Mystique released a bunch of adult-themed games such as Custer's Revenge. One that you wouldn't see coming: if you took a receipt and a label off any Purina pet food product, you got a free copy of Chase the Chuckwagon. Tom Sloper, designer of the Vectrex games such as Spike and Bedlam, was recently quoted saying, "Companies just didn't have control over what games could be made on their consoles, or when they did, they didn't exert it."
With a slew of games hitting retailers and no measures to control third-party games, not only were manufacturers slowly losing grip of console content, they would have a huge fight when it came to shelf space. Consumers became flooded with consoles and flooded with games too. With no information or anybody to help them to distinguish which were better, gamers had the impossible task of deciding.
Today, we can still see that success and failure in the industry has very little to do with technology at the time. They hinge on good marketing, shrewd management, and the quality of gameplay. By 1982, the industry was failing on two of these three fronts. Though companies were showering resources on development of games, they left out one major important factor: time. 1982 saw the two greatest examples of this. These are the games that are regularly hung with the rope woven of the crash. In a recent survey, Pac-Man was voted the most recognised video game character of all time. After the immense success of Namco's arcade classic, Atari acquired the license to port the game onto its Atari 2600 console. At the time, there were 10 million 2600 consoles in homes throughout North America, so Atari decided to manufacture 12 million. They were that confident that their port would be so good that it would single-handedly put an extra 2 million consoles into family homes. Todd Fry was given the task to port the game, and weeks later he came back with a basic prototype. Not wanting to miss the Christmas rush, Atari released the prototype as the official game. 7 million games were sold. Todd Fry was paid royalties for each one sold, which was a first for Atari, so it no longer mattered to him if the game was complete or not. Christmas of 1982 also shared another Atari disaster, promising Steven Spielberg royalties of 25 million for the game license of E.T. The owners of Atari at the time, Warner Communications, told Atari and its developers that they only had mere weeks to manufacture 5 million cartridges of the game for Christmas release. According to the CEO of Atari at the time, Ray Kassar, we had literally 6 weeks to produce a brand new game, package it, and market it. It was a disaster. I mean, the programmers hated it. Nobody liked the game. Almost all of the games were sent back to Atari. With a warehouse full of unsold cartridges, they dumped them in a New Mexico landfill site, steamrolled the land, and poured cement over the top.
The result of these two games couldn't have ruined Christmas more for young gamers than if they had received a packet of reindeer poison.
Though those two games get the most blame for attributing towards the crash, they weren't the only ones. Poorly made ports became a staple during the 80s, and here are a few of them. Nintendo's classic arcade game Donkey Kong being ported to the yet again Atari 2600. Another Nintendo arcade game, Popeye, to the Philips Video Pack. And Capcom Street Fighter 2 port to the Commodore 64 are just a few examples of quality gameplay being butchered by rush production.
Whilst this barrage of bad games were being forced into gamers' hands, it was the console manufacturers that were taking the huge knocks in both revenue and reputability.
PCs were starting to enter into the mainstream market, finally becoming available to most households. Though still costing more than a games console, they were more competitively priced than they were in the late 70s. But not only did they have superior graphics and sound for gaming, the monitors could handle a far higher colour palette. Parents felt owning a PC was a better investment for their children, as they could also learn from it as well as enjoy games. PC companies picked up on this fact and created adverts appealing to other parents with a simple question: why just buy a video game?
So what happened as a result? Consumers lost a lot of confidence in the industry, and once again business analysts saw no long-term future in the industry. The industry then came to a standstill and became dormant for the next 2 years. This was bad for the industry, as most consoles were once again reduced to bargain bin prices to sell what they could. However, this was good for the consumer, as they never truly felt the effect of the crash. They actually benefited. Thus, most people don't know of the video game crash of 1983.
In the long term, Atari was sold by their owners, Warner Communications, and they tried to re-establish their dominance in the gaming industry a few years later, but they can never quite catch up with Nintendo or Sega. After the release of their Jaguar console, they called it quits on the console market and only developed software. Nintendo introduced a lockout chip for the NES to keep control on third-party games. This in turn allowed Nintendo to keep a limit on third parties by limiting the amount of games they could develop and release within a year. That method is still used today. All games released onto consoles are done through the manufacturer. Only games that have the official logo or seal on the artwork can be released to market. Without this, the market would once again be open to a flood of games. But the most important and crucial change was the shift in market dominance of the industry. With North America reeling from the effects of the crash, Japan began taking a foothold into the industry, and to this day is still the leading innovator of the technological age. Recovery began in 1985 with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES as it is more commonly known. The 2 years in which the industry came to a halt in North America gave Nintendo enough time to plan how they would crack the market in their favour. Knowing retailers and parents were going to be initially skeptical of their console, they marketed the NES as a toy, giving the console a backseat to 2 peripherals. The first being the below average Robotic Operating Body, or ROB for short. A partially interactive robot that could stack different coloured blocks with numbers onto specific trays to help children learn colours and basic numeracy. The second peripheral was the light gun, or zapper as it was advertised. This worked in conjunction with comical games such as Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley to improve children's hand-to-eye coordination.
And so that's the story in whole. Whilst today's gaming industry is thriving and producing games on par with blockbuster movies, it does make you think. Not only would you have to ask yourself, what would have happened if the North American video game crash never took place? Ultimately, the question needed to be asked would the industry even exist if it hadn't? I'm Nick Thank you for watching. Press start.